Hello. Today we're going to be talking about some accessibility features that are built into the Windows 10 operating system. Obviously, a lot of us use Windows PCs and we don't really think about accessibility as much as some individuals who might need it. However, I did want to cover a lot of these tools just so that you have an idea that they are there and that you can use them if it's something that you find beneficial to you. So the first thing that you need to know how to do is how to actually access those settings. So from a desktop, all you would do is go down to the notification icon here in the bottom right. It's going to look like maybe a little bit of a text message. If you click on that, you'll see some options here. The one that we're looking for is going to be all settings. If for some reason you don't see all this information here, it's probably because it's collapsed. You might see something like this. However, if you're not seeing that, just click the expand button and then you should see it there. So let's go ahead and click on all settings. Once I've clicked on all settings, you'll see a list of all the settings that are available by category in Windows 10. The specific set of tools that we're looking for, the category is going to be ease of access. So we can go ahead and click on that. Now the very first thing that you'll notice is it's typically going to open up to the very first option, which is display, which is right here, and you'll see it open up there. So this little menu here is going to have things broken up into categories. So we've got vision, we've got hearing, and we've got some general interaction settings. So it's going to default typically to the display, but if that's not what you want, you can go through that list of options here on the left and you can find what you're looking for. What we're going to start with is looking at some of the display settings. So you notice here with display, it's saying basically you can make your display easier to see. The very first setting that they give us an option for is to adjust our text and font size. So here I can make it bigger, I can make it smaller. I personally keep mine about 125% just for my personal preferences, but you can adjust that to whatever you want. So let's just say I wanted to get it up to 225%. I can apply it and notice everything on my screen now is of that text size, including the text for a lot of my shortcuts here on my desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that back to what I normally use it for, or how I normally use it, and that's going to be 125%. But you can adjust that based on your preferences. Another thing that you can do, depending on the display that you're using, is you can also adjust the scale. With the resolution that I have set for my monitor, I can't really change it. It's set to 175%. But if you can adjust that, if you're using a laptop or sometimes smaller devices will allow you to adjust this. It will also adjust your icon sizes here on your desktop as well as text. You can also adjust some brightness settings. So if I were to click on that, it gives me a list of options. So the very first one that it gives under the brightness settings is night mode. So if I turn night mode on, you can see obviously it's not nighttime right here where I am, but it would dim the screen and it would also help filter some of the blue light settings. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it on now so that you guys can see what it looks like. So you'll notice it's dimmed my screen a little bit. Sometimes I like to use this in a darker room just because it's easier for my vision, but it's kind of up to you. Some people like brighter screens, some people like dim screens, and to each their own. It also will give me some options here to change some colors. I don't typically mess with that too much just because we can, if we make a mistake, it might be a little harder to actually back out of it. But the main thing there is just knowing that you can adjust some of your brightness settings. You can also simplify some animations and the transparency within Windows. Most people don't change that by default. It all typically works pretty well, but if for some reason, an application, animation annoys you or you start a program and it does something that visually you don't like, you can turn that setting off. So the next thing you'll notice under our vision category here is our mouse pointer. So if I were to click on mouse pointer, it's going to give me some options that I can change about how my mouse cursor looks. So if I wanted to, I could adjust the size of my cursor. So notice it got a lot larger here. You can make it smaller. You can also adjust the color of your cursor. So I can adjust the size, I can adjust the color, And notice here with inversion, it's just flipping the colors of whatever my mouse cursor is over. I can even choose a custom color, so if I wanted blue, for example, I could have that. Most people stick between the white or the black cursor, and it just comes down to personal preference. But that is one way to make it easier to see. If you find that you're losing your mouse cursor regularly, that's something that you can adjust. So you can also have a setting turn on or off just to show some of the touch points and visual feedback based on where things are on the screen. So that would be more like, I go to the edge of my screen, it's got the little two arrows, or sometimes if I'm over a text field, I have the little text cursor. So that's about going to cover it for our mouse cursor. The next thing that we're going to talk about is going to be our text cursor. So I'm going to click on text cursor. Notice anything that I click on pops up here. So here's text cursor. Here's all the settings that I have that I can adjust. So I can turn on a text cursor indicator. I can also adjust the size of my text cursor. So if I wanted it to be larger, I could, or smaller. This is more or less if you find it difficult or you find that you're losing your text cursor on your screen on a regular basis. So that's just something that you can adjust. You can also adjust the color if you wanted to. Most people don't adjust that too much, but we can do some different things with it. I want to make sure that the settings are back to default for me. So you can also adjust the thickness of your cursor. So if you're having trouble finding it just with that little tiny bar, you could drag this just to where it's a little easier to see. Notice if you really kick it up, it might actually cover a couple of letters if you're typing a Word document or trying to type in a URL in a web browser. So that's something to consider ahead of time, but that's something that you can adjust if that's something that you struggle with. So the next feature is one of my personal favorites. This is the magnifier. So I clicked on magnifier and it popped up with this category here. So if I turn magnifier on, I'm going to have a couple of different options. Now notice right now it's not magnifying anything. That's because it's set to 100%, and 100% of what my display is the complete display. So if I want to magnify anything, what I can do is click the plus or the minus button here, and notice as I click, it's going to get bigger and bigger. And then the way it's set right now, it will follow my mouse cursor. So as I move around the screen, you'll notice that the mouse is, or the view of the screen is following along. If for some reason you don't like that particular view below, there'll be some settings that we'll talk about that will allow you to adjust how that works. But the reason I like magnifier so much is they've added a really neat feature that's been missing, I think, from quite some time. I can click this button here, which is a read from here icon. So if I click that button and I click somewhere with text.
Use magnifier to zoom in on parts of your display. Magnifier can run in full screen, in a separate window, or as a lens that follows your mouse pointer around the screen.
So whenever I use that, if you click on the icon and then you click somewhere,
magnifier,
it's going to read what you select. Now there's also a way to get it to read a larger section of text.
Turn on magnifier. Turn on magnifier.
And usually within a Word document or a large section of text, if you click the play button, it's going to read everything that's there. So we'll give that a quick go here in just a second. So let me go ahead and get this up. So this is actually the video software that I'm using. So this might be a good example to give
Download
it a try.
now, get it free. A free version of Debut video capture software is available for non-commercial use only. If webcam recording software, if you will be.
So then notice as it was reading, it's also highlighting the text and following along. That might make it a little easier if you have trouble keeping track of your progress as you're reading through something. But just notice it'll go through and read that. If for some reason you don't like that voice, I can click the settings here. You can adjust the reading speed. So mine's set to normal, but if it's a little too fast, and for a lot of people who haven't used this much, sometimes slower is a little better, sometimes faster is a little better if you're experienced. I usually can handle about 125% speed and still follow along with what it's saying, but that's something that you can adjust just based on your individual needs. So I did want to cover that with you guys. So it also works pretty well in most settings. I haven't found very many places where it doesn't work. Um, so that's just something to consider. If you want to listen to something versus having to read through it all on your own, this would be a pretty neat feature to have access to. So I'm also going to show you guys how to change the view of how magnifier looks whenever you actually are zoomed in. So what I'm going to do here is just scroll down. Notice we've got the change magnifier view. So before we had full screen, that's where the whole screen counts as a magnifier and it just follows my mouse around. If for some reason I didn't like that, you do have a lens mode. I always like to think of lens mode as kind of like you're holding a magnifying glass. It'll still follow your mouse cursor, but notice it's only following along just that small section around my mouse. So if I needed to zoom in on things but still wanted to be able to see generally what's around something, I could do that using the lens. And there's also one other option, and that's docked. And that's basically where there's like a section of the screen that is dedicated to being the magnifier, and my mouse cursor still follows along wherever it is that I'd like for it to go. And the magnifier just magnifies what is generally within a rectangular shape around my mouse. This works well for people who have found it useful to use like a magnifying bar whenever they're reading a book. So if that's you, this is something that might benefit you. So obviously the main thing to really focus on is just knowing how to access this and being able to make the adjustments that you need. You can also have it save them as a default setting and load with Windows. I'm not going to do that just because I don't need magnifier regularly whenever I first start up the computer. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of it, and we can move on. So magnifier is a pretty cool feature, but let's move on and we'll talk about a couple other things. So I can also go through a couple of different options for color filters. So notice I clicked color filters, and here I have a list of all the color filter settings. So if I were to turn it on, notice the default setting was just kind of dimming things there a little bit. If I were to choose a different scheme here, like let's just say grayscale, notice how everything is generally white, gray, or black. I can do inverted grayscale where it flips those colors, and I can also just invert colors in general. This works well for people who have trouble seeing particular colors or have sensitivity to light. It does make it a little easier for us to see things, but that's something that's unique to each individual. We all have different eyes, and therefore our eyes perceive things differently. Now there are some settings here for color blindness, so if you have trouble with certain things, or having a weakness with green, you can turn on red green just to kind of change the shades of some of these colors to make it easier to see. And so if that applies to you, I would recommend playing with that a little bit just to see if you can find some colors that you might like that also work for your vision. It makes things a little easier to see. Now outside of those general color schemes, you also have high contrast. And basically what high contrast is just making colors that are in between really bright or really dark so that they stand out and you can see. I've had a lot of people find it useful to use some of the high contrast settings. Personally, I like the high contrast blacks. That's just me. But I've also had quite a few people that like high contrast and brighter colors and a high contrast white. So notice with high contrast black, just about everything is black except for letters. So if your eyes are very sensitive to looking at a screen or a monitor for longer periods of time, you might find it useful. Usually people with lighter color eyes, like green or blue eyes, have a little bit more sensitivity than others. So this is just one of those things that you tinker with and figure out what works best for you. Within any of the high contrast settings, I can go and adjust what different things are. So if I wanted my text to be something other than white, I could adjust it to yellow or blue with relative ease. I would just click on it, choose what color I want. Do the same thing with hyperlinks, any disabled text, just so that you can distinguish what is actually selectable and what isn't. So things like that. I'll show you a couple of the other settings. So probably the second most common that I see is high contrast white, and that's where everything is really dark colors and typically a white background. And that works well. If you need a lot of light to see things well, this can definitely help you out. You've also got a couple different presets, but any one of these you can customize to kind of fit what your needs are. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that back off because we don't need that on 24/7. It may take a second to adjust that setting on or off. And this is in addition to having a dark theme or a light theme. So those are also some other settings. Usually you can find those in theme settings. But if you do need high contrast, that's all right here. So the last thing under our vision category is going to be narrator. What narrator is a screen reader that is designed to assist someone who has difficulty seeing the screen or can't see the screen at all, access a computer by having it read things to them. This is something that usually I don't recommend playing with too much unless you're familiar with using a screen reader or you've got some time to kill, because I've had people in the past have trouble turning it on and shutting it off. If you are sighted and you can see the screen well, you have this nice little
narrator
toggle.
dialog.
You have that little toggle switch, so I toggled it on. Here it's just giving me a general message about some changes and updates that they've made. I'm going to go ahead and tell it OK.
Narrator scan. Narrator heading level 1. Welcome to narrator. This is
So then notice the first thing it did is try to read where the cursor was followed. So whenever a window opens, typically that your mouse cursor will follow along with it. If it starts chatting a little too much or you don't want to listen to what it has to say, the control key is always the first thing that I teach people how to use, and that's how to get it to be quiet. So if it's talking and you don't want it to talk at that given point in time, you hit the control key and it will stop immediately. So generally, to access it, you can use some keyboard commands. So those are usually called hotkeys. Tab, Enter, Shift Tab are some of the most common ways to navigate. Tabbing through things will go from one area and one element to the next one at a time. So I'm going to do that here just to kind of show you how this works.
quick start button. Learn narrator guide button. View the complete narrator guide online. What's new button. Get an overview of new settings button. Customize narrator.
Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and adjust some settings. You've probably noticed that that's a pretty rapid speech rate. It's reading pretty quickly. You can adjust those settings, so I'm going to go ahead and hit the Enter key with it highlighted.
Settings window.
I'm hitting Control to get it to stop talking. And then here I can go through and adjust some of those settings. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Normally, if you were using a screen reader, you could just tab through your options.
Startup options.
Notice as I'm hitting the tab key,
Start. Show narrator.
it's going through the list of options. But just for simplicity's sake, what I'm going to do is scroll down. I can get to an option where I can adjust the voice. So if I don't like Mark,
Microsoft Mark.
I can change the voice to either a female or to a couple others. There's also ways to get other voices on here. These just happen to be the ones that are included in with a Windows 10 operating system for someone who speaks English in the United States.
Personalize narrator's voice. Choose a voice.
So that's Zyra.
Microsoft.
And then we also have David.
Microsoft David, personalize narrator's voice. Choose a voice.
So I personally like David, so I'm going to use him. Notice the next setting down is change voice speed. So I can actually
Change
adjust
voice speed. Slider at 11. A.
I can adjust how quickly any of these voices reads through a set of text.
Change voice pitch. Change voice volume.
I can adjust.
Slider.
I can adjust the volume and also the voice pitch. So if
Change
I like
voice pitch.
a softer voice or a deeper voice, I can adjust that.
Change voice. Change.
So just know that those are some general options. You can also change what you hear when reading and interacting. So you can hear all details.
3.
You can adjust it just to text only, and then you can also have it go through just some of the different things. So there's varying levels of it. You can have it read all text details, which is like your punctuation and spaces and where you've entered into a new line of text. And then you have text only where it's just reading text, it's skipping over punctuation and things like that. So
Change.
those are just some of the general options. Most of these people don't adjust. Most people who are new to using a screen reader like to have a lot of the control here with hearing more of the detail, just so that they can make sure that if they've been typing something that it matches what they actually would like. So we're going to go ahead back to the top. We're going to shut off narrator, and that will get
Exiting narrator.
narrator to stop talking to us on a consistent basis. So outside of narrator, we're going to finish up here with our vision, and we're going to move into hearing. So the very first category for hearing is audio. Notice when I click on audio, it just gives me a general statement of, making things easier to hear on my device. So I can adjust the volume for my computer. This is something that you can do at other locations, but this is one spot where you can do it. You can also change device and app volume. So for example, if I had multiple sources of audio on my computer and one was bugging me or I wanted to adjust the sound on it, I could do that from right here. And also notice it's got my webcam here as well. You can see obviously it's hearing me talk, but it will let me choose an input method just like it will for my speakers. So if I have more than one set of speakers or microphones, I can also adjust that setting here. So for someone who may have hearing in one ear but not necessarily the other, or they hear really well with one ear and they want to hear all sound going through one headphone versus another, they can turn on mono audio. That way everything is directed through all speakers that they might have connected. That might make it a little easier for them to hear. But it just kind of, it depends on personal preference and what your individual needs might be. So and you also have an option to show alerts and visual cues. So maybe you can hear really well, but you're away from your computer and it's just far enough to where it might make it a little hard for you to hear an email or a notification coming in. There's a way to have your screen flash to let you know that there's something going on. You also have the title bar flash and some things like that, just to draw your attention to it so that you know, hey, there's something there that I might want to check out. So and outside of audio settings, there also are some settings for closed captions. You can adjust what captions look like. So you can adjust the color. So say maybe I'm really in the mood for cyan, I could adjust it to that, or blue for example. I could also adjust the transparency so that the text isn't actually blocking entirely what's behind it. So if I wanted it to be a little opaque, I could, or just have it completely transparent. Obviously would be me seeing through it. Semi-transparent, things of that nature. So you can adjust that setting if you like. You can also change your caption style. So if you like sans, there's a way to go ahead and add that for yourself. You can also adjust the caption size. So if I adjust caption size from 100 to 150, notice that the text got larger there as well. And if I really wanted to, I could add some caption effects. And that just comes down to personal preference. Usually that's something that you would tinker around with whenever you had some spare time and you'd find what you like best. So outside of that, you can also change the background color for captioning. So say you wanted black letters, but you wanted a yellow background, you could do that, as well as adjusting the transparency of that background. And then lastly, you can also dim some of the windowed content. So you could adjust colors and things of that nature. Basically all that's for is to help improve contrast and make text easier to read, which sounds very similar to what we talked about in Vision. So that just goes to show that you can make those adjustments there if you prefer reading text and watching a video, or if you need to do that in order to actually process what information is being discussed. That's something that you can do there. So with that being said, we're on to really our next and last category, and these are some pretty cool features in here just under interaction. The very first one is speech. So a very common question I get asked is, I have students or I know people who speak really well but really have a hard time typing or writing. This is something that can work well for a lot of individuals, provided that they have accurate and reliable speech. I'll go ahead and show you guys how that works. So to start with dictation, the main thing is that I want to make sure dictation is turned on down here. So notice there's that toggle switch. In order to pull it up, I can hold the Windows key H. I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And notice at the top of the screen, we now have that little bar that says, to use dictation, select a text field. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull up a blank Word document, and we can give that a shot. Now, one thing that I will say while this is loading is that with dictation, usually a little bit of practice and training helps. It's also beneficial to have some patience. If you're using an integrated webcam on a laptop or some headphones, sometimes the microphones that might be built into those aren't always the best. I've had the best luck with an over-the-ear headset that has a microphone that you can position close to your mouth, or with a stand microphone that you can have sitting on a table or a desk and still have it placed close to your mouth. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and give a quick example. I am using dictation, period. As I speak, Windows is listening to my voice and converting what I say into text, period. In order for dictation to work well, comma, I must speak clearly, period. If for some reason I need to take a break to think about what I'm going to speak, comma, I stop talking, comma, and then notice it cut me off there. So this particular tool is meant to just kind of give you an option. Whenever you pause for, or give you the option to convert speech into text, if for some reason it times out, you can always click that little microphone again to wake it back up. I'm not going to do that, but notice it did get generally what I was saying. Obviously, it's pulled up something here, probably not really having a grammatical error, but thinking there might be a more concise way to do it. But this is a pretty cool feature if you prefer speaking to typing. A lot of medical professionals use this. It's also not unheard of for other career fields who are typing a lot to use some kind of dictation software. For this being integrated into Windows 10, it works really well. The only time you might have issues is in a larger environment where other people are talking. It doesn't always do well around other voices because it'll try to record everything that it hears and convert it to text, and sometimes that doesn't work well. Sometimes during, if you have a cold or start having a stuffy nose, it can also start misinterpreting some things just based on some speech patterns. But it does work pretty well, generally speaking, as long as you go back and make any adjustments as needed. One thing that you probably noticed is I had to specifically tell it what punctuation to use. Just because it can convert your speech to text does not mean it's going to throw in punctuation for you, so you have to know what punctuation to use where. There's also some additional features and some additional things that you can learn to kind of how to go about revising and editing if you wanted to use your voice entirely to access the computer. So there are some ways to do it. And if you also notice in Microsoft Word, you have that dictate button. That's basically the general controls within Word to pull this bar up right here. It may look a little different. I've had a couple times where it'll pop up with an older interface. It just kind of depends on how you go about doing it. But it does work very well. So we're going to go ahead and close this down. No, I don't want to save it. And then what we can do from here, say for example, it's listening too much, you don't exactly like it, or you just want it to listen to you at certain times, you can toggle it on and off pretty easily without much of an issue. If you want to know a little bit more about dictation and maybe some of those advanced features, I would look into getting more info about dictation right here. You also have some additional speech settings, and you can just look into those. There's also some ways to generally try to train it to your voice. It doesn't work quite as well as some other programs, but it does work pretty well for the price, for not having to pay for it. So under interaction, we've covered speech. The next thing that we're going to look at is keyboard. Now, under the keyboard settings, there's a couple of different things that we can do. I always advise to be careful in here with what you toggle on and off, just because you can have a little bit of difficulty depending on what you use your computer for. I've had issues in the past with sticky keys and having it turn on in the middle of me trying to play a video game because I'm pressing a particular key so many times in a short period of time. So that's something to consider. But if you're using a touchscreen and you're used to having some word prediction, I can turn on an on-screen keyboard, and if you have a Windows computer with a touchscreen, this works pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and pull a Word document up again and just let you see how that works. So I'm going to make sure I'm clicked into my document. Let's go here. Today is a good day. And so notice as I'm typing, it's not 100% perfect, but it did try to suggest some words based on my prior word usage to generally predict what it is that I wanted to say. You also might notice that up here You know, it added an extra space here between the two, or yeah, an extra space here at the end of day before the period. So just know that when you click on a word up here, it adds a space at the end, and it doesn't always go back and correct it. But if you use some of your review features, you're not going to have a lot of issues with it, because it's going to catch a lot of those grammatical and punctuation related errors that we make. So I click on options. There's also some things that I can do if for some reason you needed word prediction but you couldn't access a keyboard or a touch screen. If you're using a switch or a button to help you navigate through, you can actually scan through some options here, and so you do have some scanning options. If you wanted to just use the on-screen keyboard but turn prediction off, you could also do that as well. In my experience though, most people who use an on-screen keyboard prefer to keep prediction on, just because it's a pretty neat feature and it works pretty well for most individuals. So if you want to turn the sounds off as well when you're selecting a button, you could also shut that off here. So we're going to go ahead and close that down. I'll close our Word document down again, and no, we don't want to save it. So we also have sticky keys, and that's basically a setting that, if turned on, when I press one key at a time, you know, instead of having to hit multiple keys at once, say Control Alt Delete, I could turn sticky keys on, press Control by itself, press Alt by itself, and then press Delete by itself, and it would let me use that button combination, but by pressing things a little differently. You've also got toggle keys, so it'll allow it to play it'll allow it to play a sound whenever you push a caps lock, num lock, scroll lock, things like that. You can turn that on and off here. You can use filter keys, which is just ignoring or brief or repeated keystrokes. So if you have a difficulty with keyboarding and it takes you a minute to get your finger to depress a key and then lift it back up, that may actually help you out a little bit too, to slow down the time rate, so that you don't have, for example, if you're typing A, it wouldn't say ah, it would just get one A in there versus maybe 5 or 10 by the time that you could lift your finger up. So you also have some print screen shortcuts and some things of that nature. So these are just generally to help make the keyboard easier to use, if any of this is beneficial to you. Then we also have some mouse settings now. Basically, the only mouse setting that we'll have here for interaction is just using your number pad as a mouse instead of using an actual mouse. So if you have a keyboard but no mouse, that works. Or if you're using a screen reader and still have to use the mouse some to try and find something that maybe narrator isn't reading, you could also use that there. And then the last setting is probably one of the coolest. I've worked with this stuff before. Unfortunately, I don't have a camera that supports it though. So you have some options for eye control. Provided that you have the right kind of camera, you can actually control your mouse cursor directly with eye movement. So to give you an example, even though I don't have this kind of camera before me, if I were to look left with my eyes with an eye tracking camera, you would see the mouse generally follow along with it. So here I'm looking to the top left of my screen. Here I'm looking at the bottom right. So it'll typically follow it. There are some unique things to using those kind of cameras that you have to factor in for, but those do work pretty well if you happen to have one. So that's going to wrap it up for our ease of access settings. If you ever use Microsoft Word or PowerPoint, the desktop applications, you'll also notice that there's probably going to be some dictation buttons and some immersive reader options. The last thing I did want to point out is, if you're using, you didn't want to use the reading option from the operating system, but you wanted to use it in a web browser, you could actually do that from within one. So I just opened up Microsoft Edge. If I want to have it read something to me, I just click the 3 dots, which is in the top right of the screen, and then I can go down to read aloud. I can also hit Control Shift and U to get read aloud to come up, but if I wanted to use read aloud, I could also just click on it here.
Oakland High School.
So notice right off the bat, it tried to read from the top of the page towards the bottom. It started by reading Oakland High School, which is what it processed as some text. So if I want to pause it, I can hit the pause button or the play button. It just depends on if it's reading or not.
School. About us.
And so notice it's going to automatically try to read for you. Now, there are some settings that you can use, and that you can adjust. So just like before when we were using the narrator voices, you can adjust the speed and you can also adjust the voice. Now in here you'll find some additional options. Since this is a web browser, there's quite a few different ones. So if for some reason I spoke Spanish, I could choose that. It's going to have a voice for me. When I go back and play,
Academics, athletics, students, parents.
it will adjust how it sounds. Now it won't adjust necessarily the language of the text, but it will at least sound similar to someone who speaks that language natively. If you need translation, there are some other options, but usually that's not within accessibility. That's just adjusting some language preferences.
Parents, counseling, contact, search, district home calendar.
So that just kind of shows you some of those options. By all means, use anything that you find useful, and also feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.